Hello, welcome to episode 5 of the Build Block series. Today's episode, we're not actually going to talk about any WordPress or Gutenberg. We're just going to talk about JavaScript and specifically around ES6, which is a newer syntax you may not be familiar with, but it's used throughout creating blocks and throughout Gutenberg. So it's good to understand the syntax. The three areas we'll cover will be Destructuring, assignments, arrow functions, and importing. And these are also there for if you do searches for these, they'll show up in MDN. So let's dive in. Destructuring is when you shorten an assignment. And an example will work out easier than looking here. So the example, to test out JavaScript, you can always use your browser. If you just use the console, I hit F12 to open that. You can also use Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I. It'll open the console. So what Destructuring is a shortcut for creating object assignments or pulling variables out of an object. So if I have an object, we'll just call it object. I'll set a property on it. We'll call it foo, and we'll set the value of that property to bar. So if you're not familiar with the console, you can just type JavaScript in here, and the return will be whatever the return of that function is. If I type a variable, it just displays what that variable is. So I have an object, property foo, and the value is bar. So I can create a new variable and assign it in one go by doing it like that. So what this says is the curly brackets are the kind of destructuring. Look inside this object and then find the property named foo, and then assign that value to this new variable that I created. So now if I have a variable foo, which equals bar. So this is used pretty often in Gutenberg when we're doing this here in this function, because this is a function. It's being passed a properties object. It's being passed an object that looks like this. It's an object, and one of its properties is something called attributes, which is also an object, but it's also being passed a function called set attributes. So these are all defined in there. And so this is some function. We'll talk about arrow functions in a second. I can type. So then inside of props, there's a property of attributes and a property of set attributes. And this is what gets passed to these functions. And so inside of here, we're destructuring what's inside this object and assigning whatever this is to that variable and whatever this is to this variable. And this gets used pretty often, and it helps. It's also what's used up here in the import. So we'll talk about importing in a bit, but it's the same idea that this is exporting different function names, and then it looks inside of what it's exporting, finds the function name that, and assigns it to this. All right, so let's talk about the arrow functions. So the arrow function is just a shortened syntax for if you want to do function, my function, parameter. Let's set this to something set. New function equal to, you'd actually do it like this. Whatever, console. So I'm defining a function which will take a parameter and just output that function. So now if I call a new function, foo, it'll output that parameter, whatever gets passed in. This can be shortened up to parameter console log parameter. That can also be said that will give me the exact same result. I'm just going to clear the screen, so we're back to the top. So that is the same exact function. You can also shorten this a little bit more if you drop off these brackets it accepts that too. So we're going to do function 3 equals parameter console log. If the function is very short and all it does is that, sorry. So then function 3 bar, it'll be the same thing. So this shortens it up quite a bit from the original function that we had here. And just the same syntax. There is a minor difference. And if you look at the arrow function definition, it doesn't bind some of the, like if it was an object, it wouldn't bind some of this stuff automatically. So you'd want to, in our case, it won't matter, but there is a minor difference in that. And usually it's for the better. So it's usually better to use the arrow functions. But in our case, we are not going to use this inside of the functions. We're not going to do anything like that. So the shorter syntax makes it quite a lot bit easier to use. You can see that's what this is doing here with the edit. It'll just return that as a function, and then edit gets assigned our function. Likewise for save. So finally, the last one was imports. And imports are kind of interesting for JavaScript because a file can export a default. And so if it was exporting, if WordPress components exported a default, so inside of it said export default, whatever, component. Then if I did an import component, this can be any name actually, import anything, foo component from this that was exported. It doesn't matter. So if this package exported here, or this file, could be anything, this would just import that default from there. In this case, what it's doing, it's saying somewhere it defines text control equals something, blah, 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 blah. And then inside of that file, it says export, I think it just says export text control. And so then I need to import it using the destructuring. And it says, okay, find what that is, and then import it that way. This is kind of explained here on the defaults and the default export. And I highly recommend NBN documentation. It has all the details. But this is useful because a lot of times you will create your own file. So in this case, you want to like maybe simplify this part out. You can create a file here, a new file, if you call it edit.js, and you'll see this in code. And so it's going to create an edit function that looks like that. And then down here, I'd say export edit, export default edit. And then in here to import that, I would say import edit from edit. And then here I would just do edit. There's actually one more shortcut. So this would all work. There's actually one more shortcut. If you just did it like this, it would see that and import it. It does the same import. If the names are the same, it does the same as that. So you'll see this pattern also throughout Gutenberg. So the edit's in a file here. This is import from that file. Doesn't do any destructuring, so it's importing the default export. So it's another common one. Then it makes it a lot easier. You can keep all your edit stuff in one file. You can keep all your saves in one file, and that's a common one. But for this one, I won't do any of that. Let's just go back, and we'll just keep it together for now. But so that's destructuring. I'll add links in the show notes, but destructuring, arrow functions, and importing, those are kind of three of the big topics that we cover in JavaScript when doing ES6 code inside of Gutenberg development and block development. Thanks so much. Hope it was helpful.